All right, guys, how you doing? So in our last video, we talked about the carbon cycle and how carbon is cycled through the atmosphere, through the rocks, and how it was stored by plants through photosynthesis and how it's returned back to the atmosphere through cellular respiration. And then we also talked about how it was stored underground as limestone and fossil fuels. Today what we're going to look at is two cycles actually, the nitrogen and the phosphorus cycle. Both of these are necessary components in building both DNA and ATP. We're going to look at them and I'll show you a few molecules that they are necessary in order to build. So let's take a look and we'll walk through these two cycles. So the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen makes up about 78% of our atmosphere, if you remember that. Nitrogen cycle, though, is the process in which nitrogen circulates among the air, soil, water, plants, animals, and ecosystem. All organisms need nitrogen to build proteins and DNA, which is what is used to make new cells. So without the nitrogen cycle, we're not going to continue to exist, all right? If you do not have nitrogen, basically life doesn't happen, all right? The thing is that while nitrogen does make up 78% of our atmosphere, nitrogen has to be fixed or altered before it can be used. See, N2, the form that nitrogen is in the atmosphere, is non-reactive. It really does not react with anything very well, so it has to be converted or fixed first before it can be in a form that most organisms can use it. There's only a couple of species of bacteria that can take atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into usable compounds, specifically ammonia. These bacteria are known as nitrogen-fixing bacteria because they take the nitrogen from the N2 molecule and convert it to the fixed nitrogen molecule of NH4, or ammonia, or ammonium, which is NH3. So after these bacteria convert the nitrogen into ammonia, what they're going to do is make that absorbable by plants. These bacteria usually live in the root nodules of plants called legumes, which includes beans, peas, clover, and several others. What's a useful thing for farmers to do is to make sure that these plants are planted in between other crops so that they ensure an availability of nitrogen in the soil. The thing is, ammonia in and of itself is not actually what's taken up by the plant. It has to be fixed into the nitrate or nitrite ions by having oxygen then bond with it. The bacteria use sugar provided by the legume to produce those nitrogen-containing compounds, such as nitrates. So you've got a symbiotic relationship happening here, specifically mutualism. The plant provides sugar to the bacteria for food. The bacteria converts these this atmospheric nitrogen to ammonia and then to nitrates. Excess nitrogen that is fixed by the bacteria then is released back into the soil. So remember how I said that in between crops, planting these plants helps? Well, that's because it recharges the soil. It puts nitrogen back into the soil and ensures that that nitrogen is now available for the next thing that grows there. So here's a picture of the nitrogen cycle, and this is just a quick breakdown of what happens. So you've got the atmospheric nitrogen, N2. Sometimes lightning can convert that into NH4, but a lot of it's also done by nitrogen-fixing bacteria that produce ammonia, NH3. Other bacteria will convert the ammonia into nitrates, which a plant can use. And then some of that bacteria will take that ammonia or take those nitrates and convert it back into N2. And that's called denitrification. All right. The thing is, though, a lot of this nitrate that's produced won't necessarily be absorbed by the plants. A lot of it will actually end up running off and washing out into rivers, lakes, and streams. And this is how the nitrogen is then supplied to aquatic ecosystems. So aquatic ecosystems actually depend on terrestrial ecosystems to get the nitrogen that's needed in the ocean, all right, or in rivers or in streams. An excess of it, though, can mean that you get a larger amount of aquatic plants and things like that. And again, there are some bacteria that will exist at all stages here that what they'll do is they'll take these nitrogen-containing compounds, ammonia or nitrates or any of the others, and they will convert that back to N2, and those are called denitrifying bacteria. So the denitrifying bacteria are oftentimes decomposers. So nitrogen stored within the bodies of living things are often returned back to the nitrogen cycle when they die. Decomposers will break down decaying plants and animals, as well as plant and animal waste products, so leaf litter that falls out or feces that the animals leave behind. Decomposers will return some of the nitrogen to the soil, okay, and some of it will go back into nitrogen gas, where it then returns to the atmosphere and it completes that cycle. So the decomposers in here, what they're going to do is they'll sometimes take nitrogen in the bodies of organisms and they'll convert it back to ammonia. That's called ammonification. Sometimes they'll convert it back to nitrates and nitrites. That's nitrification. Sometimes they'll convert it back to atmospheric nitrogen, and again, that's called denitrification because it's removing nitrogen from a usable state back to the atmosphere where it's mostly unusable. All right. All right, so the next cycle that I'm going to talk about is the phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus is an element that makes up many parts of the molecules that make up any living organism. Most often, it's in the form of phosphate, which you see above me. Phosphate is a phosphorus atom that is bonded with 4 oxygen atoms. Now, if you look over here, you can see that model of DNA that I've had on a couple other slides. If you notice and you look carefully, you can see that there are places where you actually have this very ion. So look right here, and if you look right here. So that phosphate ion, that is used as the link between the backbones of the DNA. So this sugar phosphate backbone, this is the sugar right here. So this right here is the sugar. This is the phosphate, and that's all right there. This linkage just goes the whole length there, and then the nitrogen bases are bonded to that. So that is fundamentally how DNA is made, which is why phosphate is an important element when we're talking about life on Earth, because without DNA, the information can't be passed on. All right, the thing is, plants get their phosphorus that they need from the soil and water, while animals get the phosphorus that they need by eating plants or by eating other animals that ate the plants. This is part of what's called the phosphorus cycle, and it's the movement of phosphorus from the environment to organisms and back to the environment. Now, largely speaking, the phosphorus cycle, most of the time when it's moving, it's going to be happening as a result of phosphorus being available in a plant, being eaten by an animal, that animal then excreting some of the phosphorus in its waste, which goes back to the plant, or that animal dying, decomposing, and going back into the soil, which can then be used as the plant. So this is the phosphorus cycle here. The thing is, the majority of the phosphorus that is on Earth is actually locked in rocks. So yeah, this is actually a largely geologic cycle. Now in the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle, both of those two cycles had an atmospheric component. They were found in the air at one point. Phosphorus does not have a gaseous state. It does not go into the atmosphere. It's all in the ground. As a result, the phosphorus cycle is usually a bit slower than the other two cycles, all right? If it is in rocks and things like that, those rocks take a long time to break down and become available. We do also add extra fertilizer to the ground to help plants grow faster, and that fertilizer oftentimes contains that phosphorus, which is oftentimes going to be limiting. Now, some of this phosphorus will find its way into waterways through decomposition of plants and animals, through fertilizer runoff, through any number of things like that, or decay and decomposition in the water. So some of that phosphate in the water will get absorbed by the plants in the water, will then be taken up by the bodies of the fish and other organisms in the water. As they decay, it'll be re-released. But eventually some of it will accumulate on the bottom, become sediment, and become new phosphorus-containing rocks. And that's a process that's happened over millions and millions of years, over and over and over again. So let's take a look at the phosphorus cycle and break it down. Phosphorus may enter soil and water when the rocks erode. Small amounts of phosphorus dissolve as phosphate, which will move into soil, water, and groundwater. That water can then be absorbed by the plants, and those plants can use it. Plants absorb the phosphates in the soil through their roots. And some phosphorus will wash off of land and end up in bodies of water. Once it's in that water, it's usually rapidly taken up by aquatic ecosystems, and it's oftentimes limiting. Because phosphate salts are not super soluble in water, once that phosphate starts to bond to other things, it will often sink to the bottom and accumulate as sediment. Now, there's a bunch of organisms that live on the bottom that will also take this in. Now, something I want to point out, if you look over here, you see that big, weird, crazy patch there that's like full of water and looks like sand and stuff like that. Well, that's a phosphate mine. That's actually a phosphate mine in Florida. Florida has a large amount of phosphate deposits because Florida was underwater until recently by geologic standards. So it's only the past 20 or so million years that Florida has been pushed above the surface of the ocean. All right? And as a result of that, Florida actually has very large natural deposits of phosphate from those sediments on the bottom of the ocean. Well, now in the state of Florida, what they're doing is they're mining a ton of this this phosphorus, this phosphate, out of the rocks as a result. The problem is, you see all that water that's accumulating in there. Well, it rains a lot in Florida. And so this phosphorus that's now been tapped into by mining is getting washed out into the ocean, and it's causing some problems. And we're going to talk about what problems can happen from an excess of phosphates or even nitrates. So fertilizers. Fertilizers are used to stimulate plant growth. The idea here is that with proper fertilizers, you can get more crops, more food, and generally speaking, more food is kind of a good thing. If you have sufficient food, that means nobody starves, right? That's the idea. The thing is, though, excessive amounts of fertilizer can enter the terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems through runoff. So essentially what happens is, because plants also need water, and we overwater the crops to make sure that the plants get all that water, that extra water runs off the surface, and it will carry with it some of this fertilizer, which will then enter waterways like rivers and streams. Excess nitrogen and phosphorus will cause rapid growth of algae. And excess algae can actually deplete aquatic ecosystems of important nutrients, including oxygen, without which fish and other organisms are going to die. All right? So you have sunlight coming in, and that's going to feed the seagrass and the algae on the surface. At first, they're going to take in that nitrogen and phosphorus that are coming in as runoff and as excessive inputs from land. They're going to start growing like crazy, okay? They're going to just start growing rapidly. The thing is, though, they're going to grow so much that they're actually going to block the light. So only the algae on the very surface is able to get that light. Anything even slightly farther underwater is going to get blocked from that light, and they're going to die. As they die, they will sink to the bottom, and that decay that's going to happen down at the bottom by the bacteria that's going to feed off their dead bodies, the dead bodies of this plankton, of these photosynthesizing organisms. Well, that oxygen is going to be sucked out of the water column, so fish that are swimming through there, all of a sudden, they're not going to have any oxygen in their water, and they're just going to die. and then they're going to sink to the bottom, and they're going to start to decay, and that's going to suck even more oxygen out of it. This is a process called eutrophication. It means literally too much nutrition. Eutrophication, excess nutrients, all right? And this is a big problem, especially in coastal areas. And it's causing what are called dead zones. And these are places where there's so little oxygen that everything in there is just dying. So let's review really quickly, all right? The nitrogen cycle is the process in which nitrogen circulates among the air, soil, water, and plants. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria are the bacteria that convert atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia. You need to know that term, nitrogen-fixing bacteria. That's an important term. When I highlight them in yellow like that, that's what you need to watch for. The phosphorus cycle, then, is the movement of phosphorus from the environment, mostly sediment and rocks, back to organisms and then back to the environment. All right? Fertilizers, which are produced by man, okay, are generally going to stimulate and maximize plant growth, and they will contain both nitrogen and phosphorus. But excess nitrogen and phosphorus, when they enter waterways, they will cause that grossness right over there, and that's an excess of algae. And this is literally what it can do to a waterway. You can run your hand through the water and it just comes back green and sludgy and slimy. And then just a little ways under the surface, you get this thick layer of decaying stuff, and it just smells awful. And it will suck all the oxygen right out of a waterway, and it will kill all the fish in there. And it's a very, very bad thing. It causes fish kills and all kinds of stuff like that. We're going to talk about that a little bit more when we talk about water pollution. We'll come back to organic pollutants. We talk about agriculture and those kind of things and problems with agriculture. We'll discuss this again. This is something that I've personally witnessed. I have seen fish kills happen as a result of excess nitrogen runoff. This is pretty common in Florida, especially after big storms or hurricanes or things like that, when a lot of that stuff gets washed back out to sea. A couple weeks later, you'll get a nasty bacterial bloom, and bad stuff can happen. I've seen whole beaches closed as a result of algae blooms and bacterial blooms due to these excess nutrients. All right, guys. That's where I'm going to end today. Short, quick video introducing the nitrogen and the phosphorus cycles. Keep an eye on these two. They're extremely important. We will go over them again. Just make sure that you got the key points there on the nitrogen cycle, nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And remember, the nitrogen cycle, the largest reservoir is in the air. The phosphorus cycle, the largest reservoir is in rocks. The phosphorus cycle also has no atmospheric component. That's important to remember. Alrighty, guys. You take care. You have a great day, and I'll see you soon. Bye.